In 1935, the city of Sydney, Australia had a shark attack problem. There had been 8 attacks in the last year alone, 6 of which had been fatal. And every time it happened, the local newspapers would write stories describing the scenes in graphic detail. They would call the sharks monsters and recount how they'd latched onto some poor teenager and shaken their body around like a rag doll. Certainly, these stories fueled the public's fear of sharks, but they also inspired fascination. People were amazed by the power and ferociousness of these creatures, and so they wanted to see them up close. Luckily, Bert Hobson was more than happy to oblige them. Bert and his brother Charlie owned the Coogee Beach Aquarium in Sydney. During the warmer months, the aquarium was used as a public swimming pool, but during the winter and fall, when it was too cold to swim, Bert would pump ocean water into the pool and then fill it with all kinds of aquatic creatures for visitors to see. But nothing got more people through the aquarium door than a shark. Even as the country struggled to pull itself out of the Great Depression, which was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world, a shark could still draw big crowds and big money. Over the last few years, Bert had managed to capture and exhibit more than 20 sharks. But the problem was, none of the sharks lived very long. They typically died within just a few weeks of being in captivity. And so the Hobson brothers were always on the hunt for a new shark. This was especially true in April of 1935 because Coogee Beach was going to play host to a massive parade in honor of Anzac Day. Anzac Day is a national day of remembrance in Australia and New Zealand that primarily is about honoring fallen soldiers. Tens of thousands of people were scheduled to attend the event on April 25th, and Bert figured if he could catch a shark, the aquarium could capitalize on some of that holiday foot traffic. So, on the morning of April 18th, Bert headed out onto the water in his big fishing boat. The day before, he'd set some fishing lines about 1.5 miles from the beach and baited them with chunks of mackerel, hoping that when he returned, he'd find a shark tangled up in his lines. And Bert would not be disappointed. That day, when he checked the lines, there was this massive 14.5-foot-long tiger shark ensnared in his trap. Even more exciting for Bert was the shark was exhausted and not trying to put up a fight. It had clearly spent the night before struggling to free itself, and now it just didn't have the energy to resist Bert reeling it in. So Bert grabbed the lines and attached them to his boat, and then he towed the shark back to the aquarium where it was put into the pool. Looking down at his prize swimming around the tank, Bert was sure this huge shark was going to be a massive media sensation. And Bert would be right, although not for the reasons he expected. The Hobson brothers bought ad space in all the major local newspapers announcing their newest attraction. They called it the largest tiger shark ever in captivity, and that may actually have been true. Most tiger sharks are 10 to 14 feet in length, and this one was 14.5 feet long. The prospect of seeing this giant creature attracted a massive crowd. However, for most of the week leading up to Anzac Day, the prized shark didn't put on much of a show. It barely ate, and then when it did, it just kind of seemed docile and slow. It certainly was not living up to the ferocious monster hype the brothers had been selling. But then something strange happened. On Anzac Day, Thursday, April 25th, the brothers opened their aquarium early to try to capitalize on as much of the pre-parade foot traffic as they could, but again, that day, the shark just kind of swam slowly around and barely ate, and so by late afternoon, only about a dozen people were still watching the shark. And just as those last dozen or so people were getting ready to leave the aquarium right around 4:30 p.m., the shark started acting weird. Without warning, the shark just started thrashing violently around in the water. Its body was moving so fast and its tail was flapping so aggressively that it practically beat the water to a foam. The spectators had absolutely no idea what was going on, but they were completely mesmerized by the spectacle of it. The shark then started rapidly swimming in circles around the pool, periodically smashing into the walls. And then, all of a sudden, the shark just stopped swimming. And for a moment, it just floated motionless in the center of the pool, and then it just sank to the bottom. At first, all the onlookers assumed the shark must have died. But then, they started to see this stuff rising up through the water just above the shark. And when this stuff got to the surface, it formed this mass of chunky, putrid scum that smelled and looked like vomit. And in fact, that's what it was. Vomiting is a fairly common behavior in sharks. When they get stressed out, like when they're caught in nets or beached, or when they've been dragged from their habitat and then put in a pool that's too small for them, they sometimes throw up. The behavior is even more common in tiger sharks because tiger sharks will eat pretty much anything that crosses their path, including things they can't digest, like turtle shells and metal, which is why they're always having to throw up to get these things out of their body. But no one in the audience knew this, so as this pool of shark vomit was beginning to settle on the surface of the water, the spectators just stared at it, trying to understand what it was. And as they were looking, they started to notice these shapes inside of the vomit that they sort of recognized. At first, what they saw were things like fish bones and shark fins, the kind of things you would expect to find in the stomach of a shark. But then there were also these other things that you wouldn't really expect to see, like a dead rat and a partially digested bird. And then they noticed something else, a human arm, and this arm had a rope tied around its wrist. The spectators were horrified. They started gasping and screaming and shouting for someone to call the police. Bert Hobson grabbed a stick and did his best to push the arm over to the side of the pool while his brother Charlie rushed inside to call the authorities. By the time the cops arrived, the shark had recovered from its sickness and was back to swimming slow laps around the pool. So the first thing the cops had to do was secure the arm before the shark decided it was hungry again. The detectives lifted the arm from the water using the rope around its wrist, and then they placed it inside of a burlap bag they brought to collect evidence. And then the police turned their attention to the obvious question everyone had. How did this arm wind up inside of this shark? The Hobson brothers assured the police there was no way someone could have thrown the arm into the pool without their knowledge because the shark had been under constant surveillance since arriving at the aquarium 7 days earlier. There was also no way someone could have fallen into the pool during off hours because they kept the aquarium locked when they weren't there. So the Hobson brothers were certain that the arm must have already been in the shark's belly when it arrived at their aquarium. And the victim, whoever they were, was likely just another casualty of the latest wave of shark attacks in Sydney's harbors. But the police weren't so sure about that theory, at least not the part about a random shark attack. To them, the rope tied around the arm's wrist seemed to suggest something more intentional, possibly murder or maybe suicide. They didn't know, but something seemed off. But regardless, the police knew their first order of business was just identifying the owner of the arm so that their family could be notified about their death. Now, in 1935, under normal circumstances, trying to figure out whose arm this was would be nearly impossible because DNA had not been discovered yet. And so all investigators could do was just look at the arm and see if there were any features on it that could lead to the owner. And in this case, there were. The first thing they noticed was that the arm was in shockingly good condition. In fact, there appeared to be hardly any signs of digestion at all, which was surprising considering how long it must have been in the shark's stomach. So before the police even left the aquarium, they called a fingerprinting specialist who drove out to the site and then cut and peeled the skin off the fingertips for later analysis. The second thing the police noticed was a tattoo on the inner forearm. It was an illustration of two boxers facing off as if they were in the ring. Their bodies and gloves were drawn in blue ink, and their boxing shorts were colored red. The design was unique enough that police felt hopeful a friend or family member might recognize it just from a written description in the newspaper. But when the police drove over to the morgue to have the arm analyzed further, what they would learn there would ensure that all the newspapers in the state would be running much more than just a written description of that tattoo. At the morgue, the local medical officer became instantly fixated on the question of how the arm had come to be removed from the owner's body. Up to that point, everyone, including most of the police, assumed the shark had just bitten the arm off. But to the medical officer, the arm did not look like it had been bitten off at all. There were none of the ragged tears or bite marks like you'd expect to see with a shark attack. Instead, the arm appeared to have been cut from the body with surgical precision, most likely with a knife. which meant this death was likely not the result of a shark attack. In all likelihood, it was a murder by a person, and then after this guy was killed, the shark was either fed the body part, or after the parts were dumped into the water, the shark happened to find the arm and ate it. This new twist on the case created an instant media frenzy. Newspapers all over the country ran stories about this strange situation with the shark arm in Sydney. And a bunch of those papers actually ran a photo of the tattoo, along with instructions for readers to contact the authorities if they recognized it. And someone did. On April 28th, just 3 days after the scene at the aquarium, police received a call from a guy saying he'd seen the photo of the tattoo in the paper, and he knew who the arm belonged to. Without a doubt, the guy said, "That arm belongs to my older brother, Jim Smith." To most of the police at the precinct, the name Jim Smith meant nothing. But for Detective Frank Matthews, the man who would be leading the so-called shark arm case, hearing the name Jim Smith would completely change the way he was thinking about the investigation ahead of him. Because Matthews knew that Jim could not have been just a random victim. About a year earlier, Jim had become a secret police informant. It started with an insurance fraud scheme gone wrong. Some wealthy men had bought a yacht called the Pathfinder, and then they over-insured it. They then hired Jim to be the captain of the Pathfinder, and his job was to drive and maintain the boat, and then, at an appointed date and time, sink it. The wealthy men would then cash in the insurance claim and split the proceeds amongst those involved in the scheme. But when Jim was actively sinking the boat as ordered, a water policeman saw it happening and yelled out, offering to help. But Jim panicked and just pretended not to hear the police officer, allowing the boat to continue to sink. And so later on, when the wealthy men tried to file their insurance claim on the boat, that water policeman remembered that strange encounter with Jim, and before long, the insurance claim was flagged for fraud. Detective Matthews had been assigned to that case, and Jim was one of the first people brought in for questioning. But as soon as they started talking, Jim broke down completely and told the detective everything. In exchange for immunity, Jim promised to supply Detective Matthews with information on Sydney's vast criminal underworld. This was an extremely dangerous trade for Jim to make. Because of the massive financial fallout caused by the Great Depression, desperation had driven many otherwise law-abiding Sydney residents to participate in some capacity in this criminal underworld. And people like Jim, who snitched to the police, threatened their livelihood. So, when Detective Matthews heard that the shark arm victim was Jim Smith, he assumed that someone must have found out that Jim was a police informant and they had had him killed to shut him up. But the detective didn't reveal any of this to Jim's brother when they spoke. He simply asked the brother to come down to the station and give a formal statement, which he agreed to do. The next morning, Jim's brother arrived at the police station, and with him was Jim's wife. She fought back tears as she told police it had been more than 10 days since she or anyone else had seen Jim. The last time they spoke to him, he said he'd been hired to take a wealthy man out on a fishing trip. He said he didn't know how long he'd be gone, but he'd be staying at a cabin on the coast, and if they needed to reach him, he would be checking his messages at the Hotel Cecil in Cronulla. Cronulla is one of Sydney's many coastal suburbs. By this point, Detective Matthews could tell this was going to be a very challenging investigation with a lot of media scrutiny. And part of him wondered if maybe he was jumping to conclusions. Maybe Jim hadn't been murdered. Maybe he really had just been attacked by a shark. And if he had, then most likely the rest of Jim's body, or at least more of his body, would be inside of that tiger shark. And as it happened, that tiger shark had actually died shortly after vomiting up Jim's arm. And so Detective Matthews went to the dock where the shark's body was being held by a fish oil merchant, and there he watched as the giant fish was cut open and nothing but fish parts fell out of it. This was enough to convince Matthews that this was no animal attack. Jim had to have been murdered by a person. So he tipped his hat to the fish oil merchant and headed back to the station where he would make plans for the next phase of the investigation, canvassing Cronulla, where Jim had told his wife he would be checking his messages. The first place police were sent in Cronulla was the bar at the Hotel Cecil, and immediately police got a hit. When the bartender saw a photo of Jim, he instantly told police that he recognized him, and even called him by name. He said, "That's Jim Smith." Apparently, Jim had visited this bar on several occasions, enough to be on a first-name basis with the bartender, and also the bartender said Jim was just a very memorable guy. He was tall and athletic, and at one point he trained to be a boxer, which is why he had that tattoo on his forearm of the two boxers. But the bartender said it had been a long time since Jim had come around. The last time he saw Jim was the evening of April 8th. Jim arrived in the early afternoon and stayed for several hours, drinking beer and playing dominoes with the locals, and then around 6 p.m., he left with a friend called Mr. Williams, a man that the bartender described as being very, very short. Detective Matthews knew who the bartender was talking about, and he also knew that this very short man was not named Mr. Williams. The real name of the short man was Paddy Brady, and Matthews knew he was a very close friend of Jim's. Paddy was well known to police as a master forger. He'd picked up the talent in his 20s while he was in the military. Paddy had been in and out of jail on a regular basis since he was 11 years old. In fact, the police had an active warrant out for his arrest in connection with some forging charges, which Matthews assumed was the reason Paddy was going around using a fake name. He didn't want to get arrested. But despite being a career criminal, Paddy was not known to be a violent criminal. So even though Paddy seemed like he could have been the last person to see Jim alive, the combination of him being Jim's close friend and Paddy being non-violent made it hard for investigators to believe that he might have had anything to do with Jim's murder. But over the next few days, as police continued speaking to residents of Cronulla, it started to seem like Paddy had in fact done harm to his friend. The information police gathered in Cronulla led them to a cottage on the water in Cronulla, and this cottage was being rented by Paddy. And apparently, on April 8th, after Jim and Paddy had left the Hotel Cecil, the pair had traveled by boat to this cottage and gone inside together, but the next day, only Paddy came out, and after that, no one heard from Jim again. Initially, police couldn't think of a good reason why Paddy might want to kill his friend, but when Matthews followed up on where Paddy went on April 9th, so the morning after he and Jim had gone into the cottage together, a theory started to form in Matthews' head. Matthews learned that on the morning of April 9th, Paddy left the cottage and headed for a taxi depot. The driver of the taxi told police that Paddy looked disheveled and totally out of it. Paddy asked the driver to take him to McMahon's Point, a wealthy community on Sydney's North Shore. The driver dropped Paddy off outside of this large fancy house right above the water, and he watched Paddy go inside. Paddy would stay in the house for about 40 minutes, and then he would call another cab to come pick him up and drive him back to Cronulla. Some of the detectives wondered who a guy like Paddy would be visiting in a fancy place like McMahon's Point. But Detective Matthews knew exactly which house the driver was talking about, and he knew exactly who lived there. The house belonged to a well-known businessman named Reginald Holmes. Back in the 1850s, Holmes's father was considered to be the best boat builder in Sydney. He built luxury yachts and speedboats, and he made an absolute fortune selling them. And then, when he retired, he handed the whole boating empire over to his oldest son, Reginald. For decades, the Holmes family lived like royalty in Sydney Harbor. But then the Great Depression hit, and Holmes's yacht-building business, like all other luxury businesses, went downhill fast. So, to maintain his luxury lifestyle and preserve the prestige of his name, Reginald Holmes had found other ways of making money. Mostly, he used his boats to facilitate drug smuggling off the coast of Sydney Harbor. Many people were involved, but hardly anyone ever got in trouble for it because at the time, there were only 2 cops in Sydney assigned to drug cases. But the thing that put Holmes on Matthews' radar was the sinking of the Pathfinder. Remember how Jim became an informant after a couple of wealthy men hired him to sink their yacht, the Pathfinder? Well, Detective Matthews had recently discovered that Reginald Holmes and his close friend Albert Stannard were those 2 wealthy men. The only reason Matthews had not pursued charges against them was that they had withdrawn their insurance claim after he had started investigating them. At this point, the police felt nearly certain that Holmes had to be involved somehow in Jim's death. There were just too many coincidences. But they didn't have enough evidence to actually charge Holmes with anything. So instead, they went after Patty. At 6:30 p.m. on May 16th, police arrested Patty at his home and drove him back to the precinct, where he was subjected to more than 6 hours of questioning. But in all that time, Patty skirted every one of the investigators' questions and barely broke a sweat. Unlike Jim, Patty was a career criminal who lived by a sort of code of honor, meaning he would never snitch. But Patty also realized that he was facing murder charges, which meant he could be facing the death penalty if he was convicted. So, eventually, Patty's code kind of eroded, and he made a calculated decision. If he was going to be forced to take the fall for Jim's death, he was going to make sure that Holmes went down with him. Patty told police in an official statement that he'd first met Holmes about a year earlier, back when Jim had been hired to be the captain of the Pathfinder. But after that big insurance scam failed with the Pathfinder, Patty said that Jim was left without any money because he didn't get paid for the scam. And so he and Patty came up with a new scam and presented it to Holmes. The idea was to forge checks from Holmes's wealthier clients in amounts so small that the clients wouldn't notice. Holmes would supply the checks, Patty would forge the signatures, and Jim would cash the checks from his account. And then all three men would split the profits. It's unclear why someone like Reginald Holmes would sign up for such a high-risk, low-reward kind of scam, but reading between the lines in Patty's statement, Detective Matthews considered the possibility that perhaps Jim was angry about not getting paid for the Pathfinder job, and he might have told Holmes that if he didn't cooperate with he and Patty's forging scam, that Jim would go to police about Holmes's role in the Pathfinder insurance scam. Whatever the motivation was, Holmes agreed to participate with Patty and Jim. And for a long time, their scam worked, and the three men made some nice money. Eventually, though, Jim and Patty got greedy and decided they wanted to level up the scam operation. They wanted to forge a check for a whopping £620, which, for reference, would be worth more than £11,000 today when adjusted for inflation. Holmes agreed and produced the check, and in the week leading up to Jim's disappearance, Patty visited Holmes's house many times to practice forging the signature. In fact, according to Patty's statement, that was why he visited Holmes on the morning of April 9th. But when it came to the death of his friend Jim Smith, Patty said he didn't know anything. He said that when he left the cabin that morning on April 9th to go to Holmes's house, Jim was alive and well. The police weren't sure if they believed Patty's version of events, but his statement gave them what they needed to go after Holmes. So the next morning, Holmes was brought in for questioning. Holmes was only 44 years old, and he'd lived a life of immense privilege, but when he walked into the police station on May 17th, he seemed much older and more frail than a 44-year-old should be. There were rumors that after the Pathfinder scam had failed, Holmes had had a nervous breakdown and he had begun self-medicating with alcohol and cocaine. The police presented Holmes with a copy of Patty's statement, but after Holmes read it, he denied every word. Not only did he claim to have no idea what Patty was talking about in the statement, Holmes told police that he didn't even know who Patty was, and he certainly had never visited Holmes's house. Obviously, the police knew this was a lie. But Holmes was a powerful person with powerful lawyers, and for the time being, the police could not force him to talk. Instead, they made another move against Patty. On Sunday, May 19th, the news hit the papers. Patty was officially being charged with the murder of Jim Smith. There would be a public trial, which meant if Patty stuck to his story, Holmes would be compelled to testify in front of the press about both his shady business dealings and the death of Jim Smith. Holmes knew that that kind of media attention would ruin him and his family. So, on the morning of May 20th, a day after Patty was officially charged with murder, Holmes got up early and headed down to the harbor. The weather was cold and foggy, but Holmes was determined to get out on the water. So he walked to the wharf, where his friend and co-conspirator, Albert Stannard, kept a small boatyard. Stannard wasn't at the harbor just yet, But Holmes found one of Stannard's employees who was just starting to set up for the day. Holmes asked the employee if he could borrow one of Albert's speedboats for a quick ride along the coastline. The employee could easily tell that Holmes was drunk, but he knew that Holmes was a skilled boater and a close friend of his boss, so he said, "Sure, I'll get you set up." The man filled the boat with fuel and oil and then pushed it out onto the water. Holmes climbed in, threw the boat into high gear, and sped away from the dock. It was only about 7:30 in the morning, and the ordinary people of Sydney were just beginning to board their commuter ferries across the harbor. But Holmes appeared to be on a mission. As he headed east toward open water, his eyes stared straight ahead. He pushed the boat to go faster and faster until tears were streaming out of his eyes. And then he abruptly cut the engine. As the boat gently rocked in the waves, Holmes found himself staring at a particular stretch of coastline, Piper Point, the most expensive suburb in all of Sydney. He thought about all the people he knew who lived there and imagined them reading the horrible headlines that were sure to be written about him during the upcoming trial. With his eyes looking straight ahead, Holmes reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a bottle of brandy. There wasn't much left in the bottle, but he gulped down the last of it and then threw the bottle over his shoulder. And then Holmes reached back into his pocket and pulled out a revolver. And there, within full view of the people who lived on Piper Point, Holmes pointed the gun at his forehead and pulled the trigger. The gun went off and the blast threw Holmes's body out of the boat and into the water. But, shockingly, he survived. The bullet hit the thickest part of his forehead, so instead of puncturing his skull, it just sort of flattened there against his forehead and then fell to the ground, leaving him with a giant flesh wound on his face. As soon as Holmes hit the water, he bobbed back to the surface like a cork, and for a second he just looked around wondering what happened while blood gushed from his forehead. Then he just swam back over to his boat and climbed inside. Meanwhile, the residents of Piper Point, who had actually seen the attempted suicide, began calling the police. The water police were dispatched to the area, and they raced towards the injured boater, but as soon as they got close to his boat, Holmes would just turn his boat around and speed away. This happened over and over again, with the water police trying to get close enough to help, and Holmes cutting the wheel sharply and rushing away from them at the last second. And even though Holmes periodically would pass out behind the wheel, either from blood loss or drunkenness or both, he still managed to evade the water police for more than 4 hours. Finally, Detective Matthews and his squad were notified of what was going on out on the water, and so they headed out in their own boat, and with the help of Holmes's own brother in another boat, they were able to finally jump on board of Holmes's craft and tackle him and pull the keys out of his ignition. Holmes was taken back to shore and sent immediately to the hospital, and then 5 days later, when Holmes was finally healthy enough, he told detectives he was ready to talk. Holmes told police that Patty had been blackmailing him for months, threatening to reveal what he knew about the Pathfinder insurance scam if Holmes didn't pay him. But then, on the morning of April 9th, the morning after Jim was last seen at the cottage with Patty, Patty had come to Holmes's house looking disheveled and carrying a big brown leather bag. Patty told Holmes that he'd been with Jim at the cottage the night before, but they'd gotten into a fight that ended with Jim getting killed. So Patty had loaded Jim's body into a tin trunk he found at the cottage and disposed of it by dumping it into the water. But apparently, not all of Jim's body had fit inside of that tin trunk. Holmes said that at that point, Patty reached into this brown leather bag he had with him, and he pulled out Jim's arm, holding it by a rope that he had tied around the wrist. Holmes said this scared him so badly that he immediately decided to just do whatever Patty wanted in fear that Patty might kill him too. And so from that point onward, whenever Patty called to ask for money, Holmes would give it to him. To the police handling the interrogation, Holmes seemed genuinely afraid as he spoke. He chain-smoked and his hands shook when he signed his statement, but it was impossible to tell if he was afraid of Patty or of the stain this case was going to leave on his reputation. In any case, the majority of the details in his story lined up with what the police had uncovered in their investigation. So they asked Holmes if he would be willing to testify that Patty killed Jim and disposed of Jim's body, and Holmes said he would. Now, not all of the detectives believed that Patty was guilty. The idea that this tiny guy could have killed this huge athletic guy, Jim, who had literally been at one point a professional fighter, seemed totally implausible. But with all the media attention on this case, the police were facing an immense amount of pressure to just close it. And since they still couldn't find Jim's body, Holmes' story was their best shot at closing the case. Before Holmes left the station, the detectives asked him if he wanted police protection, but Holmes declined. Before Patty could officially be indicted for murder, the police would have to present their evidence to the coroner. In cases where a wrongful death is suspected, it is the coroner's job to determine the cause of death and who may have been responsible. On May 30th, the lead detectives were called to the office of the coroner to present all of the information they had uncovered in the case of Jim Smith's death. But after presenting all their evidence, the coroner told them that there was not yet enough information to determine how Jim Smith had died, and so they would have to have an inquest. An inquest is a judicial inquiry to ascertain the facts relating to an incident, such as a death. The date for the inquest was set for June 12th, which meant detectives had just 2 weeks to prepare all of their evidence and just 2 weeks to hopefully finally find Jim's body. But at the end of those 2 weeks, despite searching the water extensively, police did not locate Jim's body, which meant pretty much their entire case against Patty would rest on the testimony of Reginald Holmes, a man who just weeks earlier had publicly demonstrated that he was both dangerous and mentally unstable. And as the days until the inquest ticked by, Holmes's mental health only seemed to worsen. He spent entire days drinking in his bed, scared that if he went outside, he would be killed, either for what he'd said to police or for what he might say on the stand at the inquest. And it would turn out his fears were legitimate. In the early hours of June 12th, the day of the inquest, a police officer was making his rounds when he noticed a car idling by the side of the road. Its headlights were on, and the passenger door was open, and the driver was just kind of sitting there, leaning forward. June is wintertime in Australia, and in a coastal city like Sydney, the wind that sweeps in from the harbor can be extremely cold. And so worried something was wrong because this guy's door is open, the patrolman quickly got out of his car and he hustled over to the idling car to see what was happening. The patrolman came around to the open passenger door and shined a flashlight on the driver. And right away, he saw the driver was covered in blood and had been shot several times on the left side of their body. By the time the sun came out and people started gathering outside the courtroom for the inquest, the story had already hit the papers. Reginald Holmes had been murdered, only 7 hours before he was scheduled to testify at the inquest. Without the police's star witness, the case against Patty Brady was bound to fail. For one thing, the police had no direct evidence tying Patty to Jim's murder, but as it would turn out, that wasn't even their biggest problem. At the inquest, which did end up happening, Patty's lawyer would argue that the court could not find Patty responsible for Jim's death since there was actually no hard evidence that Jim was even dead. All they knew was Jim was missing an arm, and people can survive without an arm. And since this was technically true, the coroner was determined to have no authority to hold this inquest, which meant they had to shut it down. Patty would be acquitted of all charges. However, he would spend the rest of his life going in and out of jail for other offenses. Jim's body would never be found, and no one would ever be convicted for his murder. Nor would anyone ever be convicted for the murder of Reginald Holmes. Although some people believe Holmes's murder was orchestrated by his old friend and co-conspirator Albert Stannard, either to help his family collect on one of his many life insurance policies, or to avoid him ruining both of their reputations by testifying at the inquest that would implicate both of them. Many people in Sydney considered these outcomes to be a huge miscarriage of justice and a total failure on the part of the police. But many other people in Sydney were quietly relieved that the people involved in this very bizarre shark arm case took their secrets of Sydney's underworld with them to the grave. Late on the afternoon of March 22nd, 2015, 29-year-old Denise Huskins reached for her buzzing cell phone, and when she saw who was texting her, she immediately felt this knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Aaron Quinn, and right now, at least according to Denise, they were off, and likely it was going to stay that way. But now Aaron was texting Denise saying he really wanted to talk to her and would she please come over. It was a Sunday, and Denise was home alone in her little apartment in Vallejo, California, which is inside the San Francisco Bay Area, and Denise really just did not have it in her to go talk to her ex-boyfriend. Really, she didn't have plans to go out anywhere. She just wanted to stay in. And so she typed back that she was in for the night and this would have to wait. But as soon as she sent that text, immediately she got another text from Aaron. For a long minute, Denise just sat there on the couch looking at her phone, wondering what she was going to do. Denise and Aaron had met the previous summer after Denise had moved to Vallejo from Boston, Massachusetts to work at a hospital in Vallejo called Kaiser Hospital. Denise had her PhD in physical therapy, and Kaiser Hospital had a great physical therapy program, especially for people with brain and spinal cord injuries, and Kaiser Hospital was also where Aaron worked. She and Aaron had been immediately attracted to each other. Aaron was tall and fit with dark hair and piercing eyes, and he loved to cook. And Denise, she was blonde and blue-eyed and very outdoorsy and driven. And so pretty much right away, Aaron and Denise would get into these intense conversations where they each would kind of dive into the other person's life. I mean, they were really connecting on a deep level. But even though they both clearly got along great and they were really connecting, their relationship got off to kind of a rocky start. Aaron had actually been engaged to be married before he met Denise, but Aaron's fiance had cheated on him, and so he had ended the relationship, and it was during that time, right after this relationship had ended, that he met Denise. And so Denise was kind of like a rebound, and she kind of felt like a rebound, but again, they're getting along great, and so both were optimistic that it was more than that. And so Aaron and Denise had officially begun dating in the fall of 2014, but 7 months later, so in March of 2015, when Denise was getting these text messages from Aaron, at least in Denise's mind, their relationship really was done. Because Denise had caught Aaron texting his ex-fiance, basically begging her to get back together with him. And so Denise felt really hurt. She understood that that was a really intense relationship. And of course, Aaron would still have feelings for his ex to some degree, but she felt really betrayed. And so she told Aaron that that was it. But it was really painful for Denise because she did love Aaron, even though she knew, this relationship likely wasn't going to work. And now, here Aaron was, blowing up her cell phone with text messages to meet up and talk, and he just wasn't taking no for an answer. And so Denise finally typed out this long message back to Aaron, basically saying, look, I don't feel comfortable coming to your house. It's the house that you shared with your ex. I don't want to go there. We can talk another time. I think for right now, what you need to focus on, Aaron, is kind of like recording me. Take me out on dates and show me that you really want to be with me, because right now there's no trust. And Aaron, to his credit, wrote back to Denise and basically said, yes, I'm definitely willing to do that. I want to put in the work to win you back. I care about you, Denise. But he said, I really have something important to tell you, and I just don't feel comfortable talking about it anywhere else besides at my house. So please, can you just come over tonight? It's really important that I see you. And at first, Denise really did just kind of hold the line, and she told Aaron that, no, I'm not going to come to your house. But again, Aaron, he just would not let it go, and he really seemed actually very eager to see Denise, and it made Denise feel special, and so eventually she kind of gave it up and said, you know what, okay, I'll come by. And after that, Denise got up off the couch, she got dressed, she called their favorite pizza place and ordered some pizza that she would pick up and bring to his house for them to eat that night, and then she headed out to her car and pulled out of her driveway. At about 5:30 p.m. that night, Denise arrived at Aaron's two-story home on Mare Island, which is actually just a little peninsula in Vallejo, California. And Denise, she grabbed the pizzas off the passenger seat, she grabbed her overnight bag because she was optimistic that, they're about to have a great talk and maybe rekindle and maybe she'll stay the night. And so with her things and her pizza, she walked up to the front door and knocked. The next day was a Monday, and Aaron and Denise were both scheduled to work at the hospital that day. But at around 7 a.m. that morning, Aaron called into the hospital sick and said he couldn't come in, and Denise sent a text message to her boss saying that a family emergency had just come up and she would not be at work all week. When Denise's boss got this text message, immediately he was like, this doesn't make any sense. First of all, Denise never missed work, so this was totally anomalous. And he also knew that Denise was applying for this very prestigious orthopedic fellowship that she needed to submit the paperwork for by Friday, and he knew she had a lot of work to do on this paperwork that basically required her to be at work that week to get it all done. And so if she was missing the week, then it looked like she would not be applying for this fellowship. And that just seemed totally unusual because Denise was really serious about this fellowship. And so Denise's boss wrote back to her and just said, I understand you have an emergency, we're here if you need us, take whatever time you need. And then a few hours later, her boss checked his phone again and he saw that she had not written him back. And so Denise's boss was like, wow, I guess, she really must be dealing with some serious family emergency that's keeping her from using her phone. About 7 hours later, at around 2 p.m. on this Monday, where Aaron and Denise have not shown up for work, there was a 911 call that came into the Vallejo Police Department. And the person making the 911 call was Aaron. And Aaron's voice was totally slurred, and then he told this very confusing story about some sort of kidnapping, and then he begged police for help. 2 police officers happened to be near Mare Island, where Aaron lived, and so within 2 minutes of this 911 call coming in, those 2 officers were knocking on Aaron's front door. And when Aaron let them inside, these officers noticed 3 things in quick succession. The first was Aaron was obviously drunk or high. He was under the influence of some substance. He just did not seem right. 2, there were at least a dozen empty beer bottles lining a back wall in the kitchen. And 3, the entire house reeked of cleaning chemicals. One of the officers immediately turned to Aaron and said, "Are you on drugs?" And Aaron would say, "Yes, I am on drugs, but these drugs were given to me by the kidnappers." The officers immediately exchanged confused glances, looked back at Aaron, and then just said, "Okay, well, we're going to take a look around." And so the officers wound up going upstairs, and as they went upstairs, that cleaning chemical smell got stronger and stronger, and they made their way into the master bedroom, and they saw the ground had obviously been recently vacuumed, and that cleaning smell was really strong in here. The sheets on the bed were all gone, except for the fitted sheet that sat over the mattress. And so the officers were about to leave the master bedroom and keep looking when one of the officers stopped and he noticed something on the bed and he called the other officer over and they walked over and they looked down and sure enough, on the bed was about a quarter-sized drop of blood. The police officers left the master bedroom and they went back downstairs where Aaron was and they walked up to him and said, "Okay, tell us again what happened with these kidnappers and what's going on here." And Aaron would launch into a totally bizarre story. Through slurred speech, Aaron would say 12 hours earlier, so around 3 in the morning that morning, so early Monday morning, Aaron said he was in his house with his girlfriend, Denise, when suddenly these men wearing wetsuits broke into the house and they immediately tied up Aaron and Denise and then made them wear these goggles that had been all taped up, so once they were on your face, you couldn't see anything. Aaron would tell the police that the intruders, in addition to wearing wetsuits, they also were carrying guns, tasers, also laser pointers, and also very high-powered flashlights. And so when they came in, there were all these lights and beams everywhere. I mean, it was totally chaotic. Aaron then explained to police that after he and Denise had been tied up and had these goggles on, the men in wetsuits came over to them and put headphones on each of them, and then they played this recording, which had this weird, soothing music, and then somebody narrating, telling Aaron and Denise that they were not in any danger, that this was just a robbery, and to stay calm and nothing would happen to them. And so Aaron and Denise had done just that. They tried to follow orders. And then at some point, the headphones came off, and both Aaron and Denise were told to go to separate rooms, and they kind of fumbled their way into the separate rooms, at which point the men demanded they give up their banking information and passwords, and Aaron and Denise did that. They gave up all their banking info, and then Aaron and Denise were brought back into the living room. They were tied back up again, and then even though Aaron and Denise couldn't actually see this, they heard the sound of somebody apparently coming in that sounded like a doctor, who then took Aaron and Denise's blood pressure before administering this drug to them that made them both very sleepy. And then before Aaron and Denise passed out from this drug, Denise was taken by the intruders, and the intruders told Aaron that they had rigged a camera system inside of his house to watch him so he couldn't leave to go save Denise. And so Aaron basically just stayed in the house until he fell asleep from this drug, and then when he woke up again and managed to get his restraints off, he saw that Denise really was gone, and so Denise had to be with the kidnappers. After Aaron was done telling this totally weird story, which again, you gotta remember, as he's talking, he sounds totally drunk. And so they kept having to ask him to say again what he was saying, and Aaron's just kind of loopy, and so the whole thing is just so weird. And so when Aaron was finally done telling the story, the two officers just stared at him in silence. And then the officers looked at each other, and without even saying anything, they both were thinking the same thing. Probably this guy has killed his girlfriend, Denise, and after he killed her, he must have spent time cleaning the house, which is why they smelled all the cleaning chemicals. And then maybe when he was done, he felt bad about what he had done, and so he began drinking beers to kind of cope with what he had done, and that's why all those empty bottles were there, and that's why he was acting so drunk right now. And then at some point, he had worked up the courage to call 911 and pretend that he didn't know where his girlfriend was and make up this whole alibi about these weird kidnappers that came in and did this stuff, but obviously it was just a ruse. This guy killed his girlfriend, that's what happened. And so finally, one of these officers spoke to Aaron and they said, "You're going to need to come to the station with us and explain yourself." It didn't take long for the police in Vallejo to launch this massive search all over Mare Island to look for Denise. And at this point, they were kind of looking for a body because based on what was going on in Aaron's house and the story he told, it did seem like very likely she had been murdered and disposed of somewhere. And so they had dogs out and dive teams out in the water. They had hundreds of volunteers looking everywhere. And at the same time, Aaron was brought to the police station and they began going over every single detail of the story, trying to get more information about these kidnappers, because as much as they didn't believe him, they did need to officially rule out that there was no kidnapping. And so they needed all the information about these kidnappers, who they were, what they looked like, what they sounded like, everything. And at the same time, police were talking to Aaron. Police also brought in Denise's roommate, and they asked the roommate, "Do you know anything about Denise's relationship with Aaron?" And the roommate would say, those two have had a very troubled relationship. And the roommate would say that, as far as they understood, Aaron and Denise were not a couple anymore. And so police would actually go over to Aaron in the police station and they would say, "Hey, we have people saying that you and Denise, who you called your girlfriend, you guys were not dating. You had broken up. Explain yourself." And Aaron would say, "Well, actually, that's why Denise was coming over. Before all this kidnapping happened, she was coming over so we could reconcile." And we did. We had reconciled. We were back together when the kidnappers in wetsuits came inside the house. But the more police looked into Aaron's kidnapping story, the less it made sense. And it really didn't make sense to begin with. And so really, it just got weirder and weirder and weirder. Like, for one, Aaron said that he and Denise had been kind of forced to give up their banking information and their passwords, and they did that. They gave that up to the kidnappers. But when police looked into Aaron and Denise's banking records, there was no money withdrawn. The only activity on either of those accounts was on Aaron's account. 2 hours before Aaron called 911, he called his credit card holder and attempted to get them to give him a large cash advance so he could buy a boat. When police asked Aaron about the strong cleaning chemicals smell in his house, Aaron absolutely denied doing anything to clean his house. He didn't know how that happened. Also, Aaron would tell police that these kidnappers had actually wanted a ransom to be paid to them, but he said it was only for $8,500. And so police are like, why would these kidnappers take Denise and run away with her and risk very serious jail time for $8,500? It just seemed way too low for what they were doing. And then there was another weird detail that came out of interviewing Aaron at the police station. One of the police officers had noticed that Aaron's eyes were totally dilated, his pupils were huge, and for a little while, police had thought maybe that was because he was on some drug or something which can cause your pupils to dilate. But based on the weirdness of the story that Aaron was relaying to them, they actually began to suspect that Aaron was having a schizophrenic break. That is a symptom of a schizophrenic break. Schizophrenia is a very serious mental illness that often begins to appear in young adults, and Aaron was only 30 years old, so he's at the right age for this to happen. And while schizophrenia does not make people violent, it does make people very paranoid, and it also can cause hallucinations and mental disturbances. And so when police were looking at the details of Aaron's story about men in wetsuits breaking into his house and taking his blood pressure before stealing his girlfriend, but also cleaning his house at some point, that just seemed so weird and kind of crazy that it did seem to kind of line up with schizophrenia. By 9 p.m. on March 23rd, so 7 hours after Aaron had called 911 to report Denise missing, the Vallejo police decided they needed to call in the FBI because this was just so weird. And we have this missing person who could have been kidnapped, or maybe they're dead or hurt or something. I mean, there was just so much going on with this case, they needed backup. And when the FBI arrived in Vallejo, the first thing they did is they took Aaron and they gave him a lie detector test, and he failed it completely. And after finding out he had failed it completely, he immediately lawyered up. By the next day, March 24th, there were over 100 different search teams all across Mare Island and around Vallejo, California, looking for Denise. Police sonar had also picked up a body-sized mass out in the bay, but so far the divers had not been able to find it. Aaron, by this point, had gotten his lawyer and left the police station. And by now, Denise's picture was all over the news and newspapers. It was up on posters on telephone poles all over town. And TV news channels were parked outside of Aaron's house, just waiting for him to come out or waiting for any activity. But despite all this activity, the detectives and the FBI agents that were working this case had really not made any significant progress. All they thought was, Aaron's definitely hiding something. But then something changed. A little bit after noon on March 24th, a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who was camped outside of Aaron's home, got a very weird email. The email was from the kidnappers, the wetsuit-wearing, blood pressure-taking kidnappers who broke into Aaron's home and took Denise. And in this email to the reporter, it said that Denise was fine, and there actually was a recording of Denise's voice reading that day's news, which confirmed that she was alive at least as recently as that morning. But there were two very suspicious things about this email. The first one was the recording of Denise's voice, the proof of life recording. Well, she did not sound in any way stressed. She sounded utterly calm, like she was reading the news like it was completely no big deal. And the second thing that was very suspicious was the email address the kidnappers had used to message this reporter was an email address that belonged to Aaron. When this reporter told police about this, investigators were like, you know what, this actually doesn't make this any more clear. This makes things exponentially more confusing. Denise did appear to be alive, which was a good thing, but it now really appeared that Aaron was involved in whatever was going on here, and based on how calm Denise sounded on this recording, she could be involved in it too. And investigators' suspicions only grew when they went to Aaron and they asked him, have the kidnappers tried calling you at any point? And Aaron would say, yes, they have, and he showed them his phone. Well, the police would trace the phone calls that Aaron claimed had come into his cell phone from the kidnappers, and when they traced the kidnapper's number, they found it was connected to a burner phone. A burner phone is something that drug dealers will use because it's totally anonymous. It's like a one-time use cell phone that you use temporarily, you have this number temporarily, and then when you're done with the phone, there's no history that you personally had that cell phone. But police were clever, and they figured out where this burner phone was actually purchased from, and it was purchased from a nearby Target, and they looked at the security footage of around the time when this burner phone, was purchased from this Target, and they saw the person who had bought it walk out of the store. And the person who had bought this burner phone was this white man who was tall and fit with dark hair, and it basically looked exactly like Aaron. And then, 2 days later, on March 25th, Denise herself walked up to her mother's home in Huntington Beach, California, which is roughly 400 miles south of Vallejo, California, where she went missing. And so Denise's mother was not home when Denise showed up on her doorstep, and so Denise wound up going to the next door neighbor and using their phone to call her father. And Denise's story that she would tell her dad was even more bizarre than Aaron's story. She said she had been held captive by 4 men in this small room, and these men would tell her that they were simply doing a task for a client, and what they were doing now with her was just following their protocol. Denise would tell police that she was well taken care of while she was in captivity. They let her eat food, they gave her water, they even let her shower and brush her teeth. Denise initially was very open to speaking to Vallejo police detectives about what happened to her, but when they said the FBI really wanted to talk to her and they would literally send a jet to her in Huntington Beach and fly her back to Vallejo, she refused. And then, like Aaron, she immediately lawyered up and stopped talking. And so by this point, all the investigators are like, there's no way these two actually got kidnapped. This whole thing is some weird, elaborate hoax, and now they know they've been caught, and so they're going quiet. And so that night that Denise was found, on March 25th, the Vallejo police held a press conference and told the public that they do not believe these two were ever kidnapped. They don't really know what happened, but at this point they are not pursuing kidnappers, and the public should not be worried about rogue kidnappers in the area. But after this press conference, the police couldn't help but think to themselves, why would these two people who are successful, they come from good families, they have loads of future prospects, their lives were good. Why would they stage this hoax? What do they stand to gain? It really just didn't make any sense. For weeks, the investigation into whatever happened to Aaron and Denise continued, but there was virtually no progress. The media was still very interested in this case. It was totally salacious, and they had dubbed this case the Gone Girl case in reference to a movie about a woman who fakes her own kidnapping. As for Denise and Aaron, they stayed lawyered up, and the only message they put out to the public was that they were telling the truth. And so really, this case just didn't make sense to anybody until about 2.5 months later, on June 5th, 2015. Early that morning, a police officer in a town called Dublin, which is just south of Vallejo, California, found a piece of evidence that basically broke the Gone Girl case wide open. The evidence this police officer found was a cell phone. Not a burner phone that's totally anonymous, but a real cell phone that is registered with a phone company and therefore is registered with an individual person. And police were able to trace this cell phone back to its owner. And this discovery would lead investigators 200 miles to the northeast of Vallejo to this small remote cabin in South Lake Tahoe, California. And at this cabin, police would find a stolen car, a white Mustang. And the white Mustang actually belonged to someone who lived in Vallejo. And so, with their guns drawn and their dogs at the ready to be released, the police and the FBI, they opened up the door to this cabin, and inside was a tall, fit, and slender white man with dark hair. The cabin was a total mess, with discarded food and trash and piles of clothes everywhere, but none of that really stood out to the police. Instead, what stood out to them as they're yelling at this guy to stay where he is all around the cabin, all over the ground, kind of on top of all the trash and mess, were things like laser pointers, and high-powered flashlights, and zip ties, and goggles, like swim goggles, with tape all across the front of them blocking out your view. The police had finally found one of the kidnappers. And while this kidnapper looked exactly like Aaron, he was a tall, fit, slender white man with dark hair, it wasn't Aaron. In fact, neither Aaron nor Denise had ever met this person, and this person, this kidnapper, had never met Denise or Aaron. There was absolutely no connection between them. This kidnapper's name was Matthew Muller, and he was a 38-year-old Harvard-trained lawyer and former Marine who had totally just crashed and burned out of his law practice and then took up this life of committing all these totally bizarre crimes. It would turn out the totally weird stories that Aaron and Denise had told police about what had happened to them was all true. The only thing they got wrong was there wasn't multiple people breaking into the house in wetsuits. It was only ever one person. It was Matthew Muller, the guy behind all this. And maybe just kind of in their panic and not knowing what's going on, Aaron and Denise had kind of thought, oh, there's multiple people here. But there wasn't. It was just Matthew. Also, it would turn out Aaron and Denise were not the first people that Matthew had done this to. The reason that police officer in Dublin, California had found that cell phone, which broke the case wide open and led police to this cabin in South Lake Tahoe, was because on the night that officer found the cell phone, so June 5th, Matthew Muller had attacked another couple in the middle of the night in their home. But that couple had been able to fight Matthew Muller off, and Matthew had dropped his cell phone in their home before he fled. And so when this couple had reported this to police, that was how they got that cell phone. In terms of Muller's motivation for doing what he was doing, well, Muller was absolutely brilliant, like borderline genius, super smart guy, but he was extremely mentally unwell. He had severe psychosis, and he was also bipolar, and so basically he wasn't seeing reality for what it was. And at some point, in one of his kind of psychotic fits, he had somehow came across Aaron and Denise and become absolutely obsessed with them. He began surveilling them non-stop with a drone for 3 weeks before he attacked them, learning their patterns and who they talked to and what they did. And in fact, Aaron, when he found out that was what Matthew was doing, watching him and Denise with a drone, Aaron would tell police, oh my goodness, I actually remember one night before the kidnapping, looking up and seeing this glinting light in the sky, and he thought, that looks like a drone, why is it out here? But Aaron was a normal person and didn't suspect that somebody who was totally unhinged was spying on him with a drone, and so he had forgotten about it. And so after Muller had surveilled Aaron and Denise for 3 weeks using his drone, he was ready. And so in the middle of the night, he broke into Aaron's house wearing a wetsuit. He tied up Aaron and Denise, and he put those goggles on both of them so they couldn't see anything. And then he put on those headphones on both of them that played the soothing music, and also had that narration where it was telling them, hey, you're going to be fine. This is a robbery. Just stay calm and do what you're told. But after these headphones went on both of them, Matthew would sexually assault Denise. And in fact, at least one other victim of Matthew Muller has come forward since his arrest to say that she too was sexually assaulted by Matt. And so after Matt had taken Denise and left Aaron's house with her, Aaron, he did fall asleep from the drug he was given from Matthew. And then when he woke up the next morning, he managed to get out of his restraints. And, he's still affected by the drug that was in his system. And he sees that Denise is gone. And so the first thing he does is, oh my God, I need to find a way to pay the ransom to this kidnapper. Because again, the kidnapper, Matthew, had said around Aaron that he wanted $8,500. And so Matthew thought he could get that money. And so he called his credit card company and asked for that cash advance for $8,500 to pay this ransom. But when they asked Aaron why he needed this money, he didn't want to give up that it was for a ransom because he didn't want the kidnapper to know that he had talked to authorities. He was worried about Denise. And so kind of in a panic, Aaron just told the credit card company that he was buying a boat, but really it was for the ransom. Also, Aaron was the one who called in to Kaiser Hospital for both him and Denise, saying they were missing work. He did this because Matthew at some point had instructed Aaron that he would have to do that or something would happen to Denise. And so again, he's just kind of following the instructions, hoping that he can get Denise back. As for the email that the San Francisco Chronicle reporter got that apparently was from the kidnappers but was sent from Aaron's email account, well, that really was the kidnapper, Matthew Muller, sending this email to the reporter. He just used a special program to basically hijack Aaron's email address. And as for Denise sounding very calm in her proof of life recording that was attached to that email, well, the thought is Denise was very likely in shock at the time she was asked to record this, and so it sounded like she was relaxed, but really she wasn't. Also, just a random side note that I'm sure some of you will have questions about. We don't know why Aaron's house smelled like chemicals. It's assumed that, maybe when Aaron and Denise were all tied up and couldn't see anything because of their goggles, that Matthew Muller, I guess, walked around their house and cleaned it, but we don't know for sure. Matthew Muller is currently serving a 40-year sentence in prison for federal crimes, and just recently he was sentenced to an additional 31 years in prison for state crimes that were in connection to the kidnappings of Aaron and Denise. Aaron and Denise would go on to sue the city of Vallejo, California for basically mistreating them. They had been telling the truth the whole time, but nobody took them seriously, and they would win $2.5 million. Aaron and Denise would go on to get married, they would have a baby, and they would write a book together about their experience, which is called Victim F: From Crime Victims to Suspects to Survivors.